strategy. My entire career has really been interested in human learning and how that applies in economic situations. And probably about, I don't know, 7 years ago, a friend of mine recommended that I start thinking about philosophy. And, as a mathematician and game theorist, I had always sort of thought that philosophy was, I don't know, trying to answer questions like things like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, or some other silliness like that. And so I hadn't really taken it very seriously, but he turned me on to Bernard Lonergan, who is a fairly well-known Canadian philosopher from the mid 20th century, who thought a lot about epistemology and human learning and so forth. And it really changed the way I think about philosophy. And so I started getting a lot into philosophy, and in particular about neoclassical philosophy, so neo-Aristotelianism, Thomistic philosophy, and so forth. And I've been using it in my research, actually, on in game theoretic learning. So that's how I got into it. And then in the business school, there aren't very many people who know anything about philosophy. And we had been teaching a certain approach to business ethics, and someone just said, look, you seem to know something about philosophy, and we'd like to give it a more intellectual foundation than what we're doing. So would you, be interested in teaching our business ethics classes? And I've been doing that now for several years. So I teach the MBA program. I think I teach all of the graduate business ethics classes. So that's probably about 500 graduate students a year. And so what I thought I'd do tonight is there are a couple of things that I'd like to do. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how I approach teaching ethics at the business school, because I thought you might find that interesting. And if I have some time, I'd like to contrast that with critical race theory, which is something that we're getting an awful lot of these days, and just sort of compare these two approaches. But primarily, I want to talk to you about how I approach teaching business ethics, and hopefully that's something that you will find of interest. So let me, is it possible for me to pull up and share a screen to share a PowerPoint presentation?
Yes. One sec.
All right. Here we go. So I've got a green share screen. Good, great. That's perfect. All right. So my title for this is Sustainable Ethics, and let me explain the reason for that. So, and let me hang on a second. So I think that in order to have a sustained ethical life, so here we see someone acting with courage and selflessness to try and save a little boy who's fallen off this balcony. What is it that allows people to do this, and what is it that allows people to do this on a sustained basis throughout their lives? So, as a business school professor, I'm very interested in this, right? So we get frequently over the years these big business ethics issues that come up. We can think of Enron and the oil companies and Exxon Valdez, and all the way up until some of these pharmaceutical ethical problems that came up. Boeing, for example, recently with their planes just sort of falling out of the sky, and it turns out that these issues with their airplanes go back to ethical problems that were festering years before. And so, as a business school professor, I'm interested in trying to teach my students a framework of analysis that will allow them actually to, not just be ethical on the small issues, but ethical on the big issues too, and ethical throughout their lives. But how do you do that? And I think that the way that you, in order to lead an ethical life, I think that the way that needs to happen is three things at least need to be in place. One, a person needs to be motivated to be ethical. All right. So if you're not motivated, then it doesn't really matter what else you have. You just won't be ethical. Two, you need to be able to analyze the ethical issues that come before you in a given day or in a given situation. So you need to have some sort of an analytical framework that allows you to tackle these problems as they come at you. And three, it needs to be practiced, right? It isn't really enough for you just to sort of think about what the right answer is. You actually need to implement the right answer. So when I was asked to do business ethics at the Rotman School, I thought, well, I need to have an approach that will sort of meet these three criteria. Now, what are the usual approaches? So one of the things that I did when they asked me to teach business ethics is I went and looked at the top 20 business schools to see what they teach in ethics. I looked at their syllabi and course outlines and talked to a number of people and just wanted to see what other people were doing. And there are basically two main approaches at business school toward ethics. The first is this one. Even at some of the very good business schools, it is very common to get a lawyer to teach the business ethics classes. So this is surprisingly common. Is it a sustainable? So this is one approach, right? I could go in and say, well, look, here's what the law says, and so just don't do anything illegal. Now I think most of us would consider that to be a fairly low bar, but it doesn't even meet the the three criteria. So what motivation does it give? What is someone's motivation to meet the law? Well, the motivation is to stay out of jail, right? I mean, that's the primary motivation. And that's fine as long as that threat is something that causes someone to follow the law, right? So if someone thinks that this is a case where they can get away without getting caught, well, then they may be unmotivated to be ethical if the way we're defining ethics is to follow the law. Now, a legalistic approach does satisfy the analytical framework, right? So I can teach you business law, and if you then have an analytical framework, you can apply it to any situation and say, is this within the law or outside the law? So it does meet that criterion, but does it require you to practice your ethics? And the answer is, well, no, not really. Right? So when you go to work for a corporation, the corporation's going to have a bunch of lawyers. I work at the University of Toronto. The University of Toronto has layers and layers and layers of lawyers that work there. So I don't really need to practice anything, frankly. I don't even need to know the analytical framework. All I need to do is pay a lawyer and say, look, I'm thinking about doing this. Is it legal or not legal? And, I get an answer from them. So this didn't seem like a very satisfying approach. The other approach, which is one that you might be familiar with, and as an economist, I'm certainly familiar with it, is a utilitarian approach. So what is the utilitarian approach? The utilitarian approach is, well, do what pays, right? Do anything where the net benefit, where the benefits outweigh the cost. So if there's a positive net benefit, do that. If not, don't do it. Now that's not necessarily bad, and it doesn't necessarily lead to bad behavior, right? So for example, if you're an economist like I am, and I have taught this in my econ classes, it may pay you to treat people nicely. So for example, to treat your employees well. Why? Well, because then you get more work out of them. It may pay you to establish a reputation for integrity. Why? Well, because it lowers your transactions costs, right? So if I have a reputation as an honest dealer, an honest business person, then when I go to write a contract with someone else, if they're aware of that reputation, well, we don't have to write such a complicated contract, right? Because they're going to trust me. If you don't trust someone, then writing a contract becomes quite a laborious thing because you're trying to think of every way that the other person can get over on you. And you end up writing these huge, complicated contracts, and they don't work very well, and you wind up in court, and you wind up spending a lot of money. So maybe that's a good reason to have a reputation for integrity. So there's a a good way of analyzing this, there's a very clear framework for analysis. So that criterion is met. Does practice make you better at it? Well, yes, it does. I figure out, how do I establish, so I know in principle I want to have a reputation as an honest broker, but how do I establish that reputation? Well, I get better at establishing it with practice. How do I treat people in a way that wants to make, that makes them want to work harder? Well, that takes some skill and practice. Is that a consistent motivation, though? Well, not really, because if it doesn't pay, right, if there isn't a net benefit, I don't do it, right? So if treating workers nicely doesn't give me the benefit that outweighs the cost of treating them nicely, then there's no reason to do that. Maybe treating them badly will get them to work harder for me. So the utilitarian approach as a basis for ethics is also sort of fails on these dimensions. And where I ended up was that the Aristotelian approach, which some of you may be familiar with, is actually sustainable. The motivation is there, as I'll explain in a moment, because the motivation for the individual for being ethical is to flourish as a human being. So the goal is to realize your full potential as a human being. So anyone that has that goal will be motivated to be ethical. Ethics is an implication in the Aristotelian framework of pursuing your maximum human potential. Does it provide an analytical framework? Yes. And do you get better with practice? Absolutely. That's how you build virtue, and building virtue is how you make good decisions, and making good decisions is how you flourish as a human being. So this is the basis for me to decide that an Aristotelian approach to business ethics was the way to go. I felt that this would be a sustainable approach. So let me give you a little bit of background, just sort of a quick overview of that approach. Now, many of you may be familiar with some of these ideas. Maybe some of you are philosophy majors, I don't know. But let me sort of go through it from the basics that I teach my students at the business school. So this is sort of an executive summary, right? We're just gonna fly along at the 35,000 foot level and hit some highlights of the Aristotelian approach. So the first thing, and again, this may be reminding some of you who have had some of this material before, but let's just sort of refresh our memories if that's right. Aristotle has a very, and by the way, so one of the things that you also have to understand, because if you're at Kintor, you may be exposed to Catholic, maybe Thomistic ethics or sort of a Catholic spin on ethics. I happen to be a practicing Catholic, and I think St. Thomas takes Aristotle up to level 11. But this is not something that we teach in a secular university. I don't teach Catholicism. I'm sure I'd probably be fired tomorrow if I tried to do that, and it wouldn't be appropriate for a lot of people who happen to be Hindu or secular, or we have a wide range of students, a lot of diversity there. So I need to have an approach that's going to work for everybody, and that's another reason to go with Aristotle. I've had really every type of student. Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, like I say, secular people. I've had Jainists, basically everybody. And everybody gets something out of Aristotle. So even people with a faith tradition, and even if that faith tradition is not, some form of Christianity, everybody has something to take from Aristotle. And all of my students, I've had, all of my students, or not all of my students, but students from sort of every faith tradition and no faith tradition who have found this material very motivating for them. So that's one reason that I take this approach, right? It's consistent with my own deeply held beliefs, but it's also something that works for everybody. So, and we can talk maybe at the end, what does Catholicism sort of add to this, if that's something that you're interested in. But for the purposes of going out there in a secular world and saying, look, why should you be ethical? This is the argument, right? So the first part of the argument is, what is the definition of good? And Aristotle takes the approach that he says, look, everything is a certain kind of being, whether the being, and he refers broadly, being has a very broad meaning. So if the being is a tree, or the being is an animal, or the being is a human, these are just different types of beings. And what is good is always defined in relation to that type of thing. It's what is good for that type of thing. And what is good for that type of thing is anything that moves that thing toward fulfillment of its essential nature. So anything that makes the lion more lion-like is good for the lion, and anything that takes the lion further away from the prototypical lion is bad. So here we have a picture of a three-legged lion. Something obviously bad happened to the lion, and we know that that lion is not as complete a lion, a specimen of a lion, as a lion, healthy lion with 4 legs, for example. So this definition is not controversial. People are good with this definition. The second part of Aristotle that's very important is the distinction between actual things and potential things, right? So a rubber ball is round, yellow, solid, and bouncy, and that's what it actually is, and we know that, right? We have the capacity to know that a yellow ball is not a goldfish, right? A goldfish has other aspects. Now, whatever the thing is, it comes equipped with certain potentials, certain potencies. So a round yellow ball, rubber ball, can be squished. If you threw it into the fire, it would melt. There are certain things that can change the way the yellow ball is due to what it is, due to the type of thing it is. And these potentials to change exist within the ball. It's part of what the ball is. So we think of the potentials of a thing as residing within the thing, given the type of thing that it is. All right. And these are very concrete, what these potentials are. Okay, so that's step 2. Now, this leads us to the Aristotelian concept of hyalomorphism, which comes from the Greek words hyale and morphe, matter and form, that all things, a rubber ball, a rubber duck, a lion, an oak tree, are all composites of matter and form. So an oak tree is matter in the form of an oak tree. So matter in this philosophical approach is what gives actual things the potential to change in various ways. And the form is the way that matter has been actualized as it is right now at this moment. So it's these two things together that make something what it is and give it the potential to change into the future. Now, there is one more distinction that I would make here, and it's the distinction between accidental form and substantial form. So accidental form are the things that are part of the being that are not essential to it. So if we think about a rubber ball can be any color and still be a rubber ball. So the color of the rubber ball would be called an accidental form. It's part of the rubber ball, but it's something that can change from rubber ball to rubber ball. The substantial form is the thing that really nails down the essential characteristics that, for example, make a rubber ball and not a rubber duck, or not a goldfish, or not a human being. So the substantial form is the thing that really nails down what it is, what that thing is. Okay? So everybody good so far? So that leads us then to living things. So living things have souls, according to Aristotle. And he uses the word very broadly. So for Aristotle, an oak tree has a soul. Anything that's alive has a soul. And what he means by that is simply the substantial form of a living thing. So whatever the substantial form of a living thing is is what Aristotle's referring to as its soul. So we would say a soul is that by which one is a living being of a particular kind. It's the soul that makes it a living being of the kind it is. So, for example, and for some reason, don't ask me why. So, as an economist, I find this very puzzling, but philosophers love to use cats as examples. So whenever you read a philosophy book, it seems to be filled with examples of cats to illustrate points. So I'll do the same. I'll illustrate the point with a cat. So a cat is a cat. So this is a living cat. So there's a cat flying down from a tree. Maybe he's gone after a bird or a squirrel or something. And the cat has an unfortunate accident with a wood chipper, let's say. And what comes out the other end are cat parts, right? And the cat parts are matter, but they're no longer in the form of a living cat. So at that point, the cat parts are not a cat. And the soul, you know, they are not matter in the form of a living cat. And so this is really an important idea, because what it says is that a cat has potentials that are unique to it as a whole being, right? A living cat. So what are some of those things? Well, a cat can pursue its own good, for example. A cat can make more cat kind, right? It can reproduce. A cat can star in YouTube memes, which is a very popular form of cat behavior. Cat parts? No, cat parts can't do any of that stuff. So we would say that a cat is a substance. So again, I'm using this sort of Aristotelian philosophical language that a cat is a substance, which is matter in the substantial form of a cat. The substantial form is getting at the idea that the potentials of the whole are greater than the sum of the potentials of its parts, right? That's kind of the purpose of this illustration, that the cat has potencies and potentials that can be actualized, for example, the ones that I list on the left, that are simply not available from a pile of cat parts. So we would say a new substance is created when a cat comes to be, all right? So where does this lead us? Well, it leads us to a couple of places. So the first place that it leads us is to categories of living things. For Aristotle, there were three. We know now this is a little bit too simplistic, but nevertheless, it's useful. He thinks of living beings as falling into either vegetative category, sensitive animal, or rational animal. And each higher form inherits the potencies or potentials of the lower ones. So what are the potencies of a vegetative soul? Well, it feeds, it gathers nutrients, it grows, it reproduces. Those would be the main ones. A sensitive animal or a sensitive soul has all of those potentials and cognitive apprehension of sensitive realities, or sensible realities. So, if we're thinking about that lion, the lion sees, smells, hears, it's aware, it's sentient, and it can move, right? And it can move. The rational soul inherits all of those capacities, plus two really important ones: intellect, which is a capacity for abstract conceptualization. And the Greek word for intellect literally means the ability to use language, right? And a will, which is a capacity for free choice. So these two things are quite important together, the ability to think abstractly and the ability to freely make choices. All right. As far as we know, and this is an open issue, but as far as we know, human beings are the only animals in the category of rational animals. So we haven't found any other animals that clearly have the capacity for abstract conceptualization and the capacity for free choice. So even when we think about, and people have been studying this for a long time now, so trying to identify abstract conceptualization abilities in animals. So animals are very, very smart and very clever. Some of the smartest include chimpanzees, the greater apes, gorillas, dolphins we know are very intelligent. Surprisingly enough, crows are very intelligent, parrots are very intelligent. So there's some very intelligent animals, but they don't appear to have this ability for abstract conceptualization. And that's really important because if you don't have a capacity for abstract conceptualizing, you don't really have a capacity for having free choices. These two things go hand in hand. So if you think about it for a second, when when you're thinking about an important decision, like what job should I take? So I've just had 3 job offers, and, which is an amazing thing given the lockdowns that we're in and all this craziness. But let's just say that I've got 3 job offers, and now I'm thinking about which one to choose. Well, what I'm going to try and do is decide which one is best for me, and I'm going to order them in terms of goodness for me. But the concept of goodness is an abstract concept. So I can't even get off the ground if I don't have the capacity to think in terms of the abstraction of goodness or the abstraction of truth. What would truly be a good job for me? There you've got 2 abstract concepts going on. So basically, I can't begin to choose anything if I can't think in those abstract terms. Now, that's not to say that animals aren't very clever. So this is a very simplified, stripped down version of animal cognition. They do have imagination. So what this is showing you on the left is something happens in the real world. The animal, let's say a gorilla or some relatively intelligent animal, observes the world. Its imagination is the part of its mind that allows it to do pattern recognition. So I may notice that there's a banana and that seems like food, and I recognize it as such. I may recognize dangers in the environment, and then what happens is that the animal will be either drawn towards pleasurable things or away from painful things, right, or frightening or endangering things. And their desire is then sort of predetermined by their programming. They have instincts and instinctual behavior, and then they act. Then there are consequences to their action, which then they can learn from. So there is a learning process within animals. There's no question about it. And you can get really far with imagination. So for example, there are some chimpanzees that have figured out how to use sticks to dig ants out of trees. And it's really quite remarkable. So they'll fray an end on a stick and dig ants out because their fingers won't go in these holes. They're too small, and they'll dig ants out and eat them. And they can see other apes doing this, and then they'll copy the apes. All of that kind of behavior is possible through pattern recognition, memory, and recognizing, and sort of thinking through these patterns. So you can get very, very far just with imagination. So there's no question that there are very clever animals. And I want to be clear, there may be other animals that are in fact rational animals. So there may be other animals that we haven't discovered, or it may be that we haven't figured out how to identify abstract conceptualization in animals, or it may be that there are species elsewhere in the universe that have this capacity. I'm not taking any position on that. I'm just reporting that of the research that we've had so far, it doesn't seem that, that we found any such animals yet. Now, this is humans, which are rational animals, have sort of a much more elaborate cognitional structure. So like sensitive animals, or the sensitive class of animals, there will be something that happens in the world around us. Our senses report that to us. We also inherit imagination, so we also do pattern recognition. We store patterns in memory, so there's all of that. We also inherit what we call the passions, right? So the passions are our emotions and our instinctual behavior that that kind of push us toward pleasure and cause us to run away from pain. So our emotions are all about that. They're called passions because the Latin root for the word passions is passive. So we react, our emotions are responses, sort of automatic responses to what's going on around us. We may feel fear, we may feel desire, we may feel anger, right? But these are things that are prompted in us by the environment that we find ourselves in. However, all of this sort of reports into our speculative intellect, which is the part of our mind that allows us to process this and think, well, what is going on here, right? We have the ability to think in terms of abstract concepts. We also have the ability to think in terms of causality. Causality is an abstract concept. So we're thinking, well, what if I do this, will it cause that? What are the consequences to choosing action A over action B? This all requires this sort of cognitional architecture of being able to think abstractly. And in particular, as I said earlier, asking the question, well, what is truly good for me, right, requires a judgment of truth, which is an abstract concept, and a judgment of what is good for me. Now, so my speculative intellect allows me to do that, which then can report that to my practical intellect, which is the part of my intellect that thinks about, well, how do I implement that? So I've decided that I'm going to go look, that now is the time for me to start applying for jobs, and then I should say apply for jobs in the healthcare sector, suppose. Okay, well, that's a fine decision. My speculative intellect has identified that. Now I have another part, which is the practical intellect that goes, okay, now I actually have to put together an action plan and implement that action plan. And then my will move toward the perceived good, right? So the will is always the part that I want to choose things that I think are good for me. Now, does that always work? Do I always get it right? Well, we know that we're very fallible and we don't always get it right. And we know that our passions can sometimes overwhelm our intellectual capacity. So if I'm someone who doesn't have any control over his anger, then, I'm always being driven by whatever I happen to be angry at the moment. And then I act, eventually I will do something. That act has consequences. And as with the sensitive sentient animals, those consequences will be remembered. I will see patterns in the consequences. I will identify those. But I can also think about what those consequences were using my speculative intellect. So these are the features that really seem to make human beings unique. And therefore, they are apparently the essential things of what it means to be human, being able to think abstractly, identify things, not be a prisoner to your passions. All of these things seem to be what really make human beings unique. And that's important because if you follow sort of the few steps before that, if we're thinking about what's good and we're thinking about, well, what does it mean for me to flourish as a human being, right? That's the kind of thing I am. I'm a human being. I need to flourish. I want to realize my full potential as a human being. Then, in particular, what it doesn't mean is simply relying on my feelings and emotions to drive everything I do. If I'm just using my emotions to drive my behavior, then I'm really no different than the other animals. But if I'm using my intellect and these special human intellectual capacities, then I'm engaging the human part of me. And so somehow sort of mastering those features of your human nature seems to be key to flourishing as a human being. Now, just a quick word about the passions. I said that these are our sensitive appetites. There are urges, emotions, feelings. These are all things that are influences on our behavior that do not, that exclude reason, right? And so concupiscence is a sort of built-in desire to possess sensible goods, in other words, real world things, that we don't have. So in other words, I want to be comfortable. I would like to have, you know, I'm giving this talk, but afterwards my wife sent out for some pizza. I'd like to go have some of that pizza. These desires are not good or bad, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with these passions. In fact, we've have these, you know, these are sort of our built-in desires for things that are in fact good for us in limit, you know, within limitations. But the fact that these things are sort of pushing always in these directions towards pleasure and physical pleasure can be dangerous, right? And they can be dangerous in a way that you know, the way Aristotle describes the emotions is that they're a little bit like getting drunk, right? They can influence your ability to think clearly. And so it's very important to be able to keep your emotions aligned with reason. That's the key. And so you want to not be a slave to love or any other emotion for that matter. Okay, so the point of the intellect then is that the intellect frees us from our passions. We are not robots that just react to whatever it is that's happening in the world around us. Something happens, it triggers an emotion, and then boom, off I go, either in fear or you know, or towards something that looks pleasurable. It's the intellect and our ability to think about these things carefully that eventually lead us to be free from our passions. In other words, to channel our passions in productive ways. So, for example, courage is considered a virtue. Why is it a virtue? Well, it's a virtue because it's applying your intellect in situations that appear to be harmful to you, right? Now, and the thing is that there isn't a one set rule about what it means to be courageous, right? So, for example, if my wife and I used to live in Los Angeles, and we lived through the Northridge earthquake, which was very frightening. But you can imagine that in an earthquake, the appropriate thing to do is to leave the building and get out of it and go out onto the street where something won't collapse on you. So there you're feeling fear, and the right thing to do is run away. I mean, that's using your intellect properly. You will exit the building and get away from the danger. On the other hand, you might be passing a house on fire, and you might hear the cries of a baby or a child inside the house. And there it may be that the right thing for you to do is to try and go in there and save a life, even though it's dangerous. So the point of courage is not that you act recklessly all the time. It's that you use your intellect to think carefully about what is the right decision under these circumstances. So courage is mastering fear, which is situations harmful to human life. Temperance is the virtue of mastering your corporeal desires, which are four things that are beneficial. It is good to eat food, right? It is good to reproduce. I mean, all of these things are good and necessary for a human being, but the key there is to use your intellect to sort of make decisions that are truly good for you. So these are what virtues are, right? Virtues, and of course there's fear, courage, and we can list, you know, a whole list of virtues. The virtues are always the application of your intellect to a given situation to make a choice and do an act that is really, truly good for you, that will really cause you to flourish as a human being. And so living the good life means the following. It means that you commit human acts. So a human act, right? We just said, what is unique about humans? Well, a human act is something that's been deliberated, where you have this ability to choose, and you apply that ability to the situation using your intellect. So you're assessing, what is it that is truly good for me in this situation? And it's deliberate. I've freely chosen it. So to the extent that I'm being coerced or forced, or I don't have a choice for some reason, that would not be a human act. And if I do something in ignorance, because I don't know and I haven't deliberated it, that's also not a human act. So a human act is an act where I've thought about it and then I make a choice, right? And those are the most important kinds of acts for human beings. Ethical act, now notice, human acts, a human act can be a bad act, right? So when we think of a war criminal, for example, many of those crimes are going to be deliberated and deliberate, right? Now, does that make the war criminal fulfill their potential as a human being? No, not at all. It's making them more beastly. They're not, they may think they're doing something that's good, but in actuality, they're destroying their own human nature. So an ethical act is simply a human act that is consistent with human flourishing. That's what an ethical act is. So it's making choices that are truly good for you. And this, and so a virtue then is a stable capacity to act ethically. So you can make an ethical act because, you've really struggled. So there's a piece of pie on the table. I know that I shouldn't eat it, but man, I really want it because it's, apple pie is my favorite. It's apple pie a la mode. And oh my God, it just looks so delicious. But no, I really fight it. And I decide, no, I know I shouldn't, so I won't eat it. Well, that's an ethical act. You've made a good choice for yourself. Is it a virtuous act? Well, not really. It isn't, because you struggled. The fact that you struggled indicates that you don't have the virtue of temperance yet. So a virtue is a stable capacity to act ethically. In other words, you build up within yourself a desire, sort of a stable desire for the ethical behavior. So virtuous behavior, when I say I can make a courageous act, let's say, that's one thing. But having the virtue of courage is that whenever these situations come up, I behave appropriately. I've developed the ability to overcome my fear and to make good choices in these situations that are threatening. That would be the virtue of courage. And so character, which is how the positive psychologists think about it, is a portfolio of your virtues and vices. So you can have good character, you can have bad character. Good character means you've got a portfolio of virtues, right? Consistent with virtuous behavior. And so this now goes back to the beginning, and I'm sort of blowing through this very quickly, but all humans have character, whether your character is good or bad. So that's having character is an essential form, is part of your essential form. Remember, we're talking about essential form and accidental form. So all humans have character. That's part of your essential form. The type of character you have is accidental, right? So I can have blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes. I can be blonde or be bald, as I am. I can have white skin or dark skin. I can be male or female. All of those things are features of being human, but they're accidental features. They are not essential to being human. What's essential to being human is my intellectual capacity. And this is something that all humans have, right? I mean, unless they're, have health problems of some kind. So we have the ability to form our own characters. And this is sort of the superpower of being human. We have the ability to form our own character over time. And how do we do that? Well, we do it by committing ethical acts. By committing the ethical acts, we build the virtues, and our character becomes virtuous. So we have this sort of unique ability to change our own forms. It's like I say, I mean, it's like a superpower. It's amazing that we have this capacity to do this. And so good character implies that you're leading a flourishing human life. It means that you're engaged in your life, you're mindful about what's going on, you're paying attention, and you're choosing things that are truly good for you, right? And this is what will lead, according to Aristotle, to happiness, which is ultimately what we all want. We all want to be happy, not in the sense of just having a feeling of momentary, emotional pleasure, but of having sort of this deep satisfaction of having, of just living in a place where you are banging along on all cylinders, right? Banging on all cylinders, fully engaged with life and fully flourishing. So that's this sort of very, very deep level of human happiness. And so developing good character, right, is being motivated by your desire to be happy, right? And so this is self-motivating, and this now comes back to the very beginning of the talk, which should be sustainable, right? Now, in other words, I'm not giving you a list of what the law says that that you may agree or disagree with the law. I'm not telling you that that you should just benefit yourself in a utilitarian way. In fact, I'm telling you, well, I am saying that you should benefit yourself, but I'm telling you should benefit yourself in the sense of flourishing as a human being, not in the sense, for example, of consumption, right? Of consuming pleasurable things. And so anyone who is on the path and anyone who cares about being happy and leading a flourishing human life and realizing their full potential as a human being should want to develop good character, because the two things are basically synonymous with each other. And so what I find is that MBA students, most of whom have not been exposed to any of this kind of thinking, find this liberating. They really, I have students who come to me and say, I've never thought about this way. And of course, business school students get a bad rep. A lot of times when I go over to the philosophy department, they all, make fun of me and, criticize my students. Like the Rotman School is like Darth Vader on the campus or something. And, some comment about greedy, selfish business students. But of course, that isn't the case, right? The business students are intelligent people who want to make a difference in the world. I see it in this younger generation more than in any other generation, people who really committed to doing some good. And the problem is that they don't quite know how to do that. They don't really have a roadmap. And so I think a lot of them find this very liberating, very, very helpful. And, I have lots of testimonies from students to this point. So this is the point. The point is to say, look, if you're going to lead an ethical life, you need to be motivated, and this is motivating. Be on the path of flourishing as a human being. Go do that. And it isn't easy. It isn't going to happen tomorrow. It's a day in and day out kind of a thing. You've constantly got to be working on it. But if you do, and if you fall off the wagon, get back on the wagon, be in a community of people that will help you grow in this way and that will support you. Create that, that environment, you will lead this sort of deeply happy life. And so this is why I teach this approach. And I will, make this note that Aristotle recognizes that friendship, a particular kind of love, is the highest virtue. So one of the things that Aristotle, I make all my students read the Nicomachean Ethics, and that book is an exploration of, well, what is the best virtue? So we have all these virtues. Everybody understands courage and temperance and everything, but what is the best virtue? And where he ends up is, and remember, when you say best, what question are you asking? You're asking the question, well, what makes us most human? Right? What causes me to flourish most? Where am I using my maximum capacities as a human being? And the answer is in this kind of virtuous love. Now, by virtuous love, we're not talking about a feeling of passion. We're talking about desiring the good for someone else, right? It's wanting good for others. And that's a choice, right? That means that I'm just making choices. That's why we can say, well, love your enemy. We say, well, love your enemy. We're not saying go hug your enemy or try to generate feelings of warmth towards someone who's doing you wrong, or, sing Kumbaya with them or something like that. No, what we're saying is look, you may not like the person. You may find them really annoying. You may be angry at them because they're not doing nice things to you. Nevertheless, you can make choices for their good because you are a rational human being and you know how to think about that, and you know how to make those choices. Now, why is that the highest virtue? Well, it's the highest virtue because when you're thinking about courage or temperance, you're thinking about yourself, right? But when you're thinking about doing good for someone else, you actually have to go through several steps to get to the point where you can do that. So let me explain what I mean by that. I was listening to a talk recently. This is a really good way of thinking about this. I was listening to a talk by some people that interrogate terrorists, captured terrorists. And they're pointing out that, well, the first level of sort of using your capabilities is to realize the situation that you're in. So, I'm in a situation where there's me and a terrorist, and I'm trying to interrogate them. Then there's sort of a second level, which is being able to to switch roles so that you're in their shoes. So this is, now I'm gonna assume, well, what would I be thinking if I were in this person's shoes, right? Then there's a higher level beyond that, which is to go, not what you would be thinking if you were in their shoes, but what are they thinking in their shoes, right? And so that requires a whole other level of skill. And this virtuous love requires that. It requires you to be completely outside of yourself and thinking about the good of others as to what is really good for the other. It may not be what they want, by the way, right? So if someone's a drug addict, they may want more drugs, and you know that that's not good for them. So it doesn't mean give someone whatever they want, but it means treat them in a way that, and do for them, serve them, right? Develop a servant's heart so that you are serving them and doing good for them, just for their sake. Like, not that you get something out of it, but you're doing it for them, for their sake. Now, when I say you don't get anything out of it, of course, that's not correct. You do get everything out of it, right? So when you're doing good for others, you are, in fact, realizing your full potential as a human being, and this is ultimately what will make you happiest. So loving others, as it turns out, is the highest virtue, and it engages all the other virtues, engages justice, courage, temperance. All the virtues are required to be in place in order for you to exercise and develop this virtue. So this is something that I teach my students, that as business students and as business people, they want to be creating environments in which the people that work for them are realizing their full potential, or are facilitated to do that, where they're helping their bosses realize their full potential, where all the stakeholders that they deal with, suppliers, customers, everyone that they come into contact with, if they want to be a virtuous business leader, requires them to have this outward going sense of responsibility to help others realize their full potential. And it's interesting, but it is that sort of giving of yourself that actually allows you to realize your full potential. Okay, so let me see how I'm doing. So it's 8:30, which is the end. So should we quit here? This is a stopping point. I could go for a little bit longer if you're interested in adding to it.
Maybe like 5 more minutes, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay, so let me, I'll try to do this quickly. One of the things that has come up a lot now is racism. This is a very, very big topic. And one of the things that we sort of get exposed to is critical race theory, and we may not even know it. So some of you may have been exposed to critical race theory. Some of you may not. It is sort of all over society in ways that people are sort of embracing it without really understanding what it is. So we all agree that racism is appalling and horrible, and we want to try to end racism wherever we see it. And notice that the Aristotelian point of view says, well, look, we can develop within ourselves. So remember what I just said. I may not like someone, I may be angry at someone, but I can still use my virtue of love to think about how I help them. Well, that applies to everything. So there's nothing there's sort of Aristotle has a very optimistic view on racism, that we can work at it. And, if we feel antagonistic towards people of other races, then that is something that we can work on and overcome as human beings, because race is not an essential feature of human nature. It is an accidental feature of human nature. So we should realize that what makes us human is not our skin color, right? So pursuing the greatest virtue of intentional love is clearly anti-racist, right? It is absolutely anti-racism, anti-racist. So and sometimes, it isn't necessarily easy, but this is where we should all be going. And Aristotle is sort of very optimistic about this. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where he's talking about, that one day he hopes his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And he exactly meant character in the sense that I've been talking to you about it now. Now, critical race theory is what we're seeing a lot of, and I just want to go through it. I can do this in just a couple of minutes, but I want you to sort of see the structure of the argument here, because it is an alternative way of thinking about the world. First of all, in critical race theory, I'm just going to give you like 5 bullet points of critical race theory, but I think you'll start to see the structure, and once you do, you'll begin to recognize it when you see it. In critical race theory, the unit of analysis is the racial group. So it is not the individual. So unlike Aristotle, we were all sort of involved in our own self-development projects. In critical race theory, it's groups, and in particular racial groups, that are the unit of analysis. We never get to the individual. We're always talking about the group. The assumption is that the goal of all racial groups is material well-being. So it is not a spiritual point of view. It's that all people want, it's a very materialist theory that groups want to be materially better off. And that racial groups can be ordered in terms of the social power that they wield. So there is a sort of hierarchy of racial groups in terms of their social power. And the fourth step in the argument is that social power determines material outcomes. Right. So it is this idea that, well, we're all the groups are in it to be better off materially. We have various levels of social power, and it is the social power that allows us to get stuff. And so it is really determined. Now, remember, this is always working at the level of the group and not the individual. So this is a very key part of the analysis then, is that the dominant racial group, sort of the racial group that is at the apex of the hierarchy, through its social power, arranges all social institutions, including formal institutions like the economy, the law, as well as informal institutions, language, culture, ways of understanding. Basically, every single thing in society, the dominant group has fine-tuned to maintain its dominance. All right. And then if that's all true, and, if these assumptions are true, then you get something called systemic racism. Now, systemic racism is not a vague idea that there's something that's kind of works against particular social groups. Systemic racism is a very specific term of art to critical race theory. And the systemic racism means what I just said. It is this idea that all 5 of these steps are at play, and that everything in society has been fine-tuned by the dominant group against everybody else. And that's what makes it systemic. So the dominant or privileged racial group enjoys superior social outcomes, which is their supremacy, while other minoritized racial groups continue to suffer adverse, automatic, and normalized social outcomes. So this is critical race theory, and this has really caught hold. So critical race theorists have been publishing lots of books. They get out into the public, and the public sort of has a vague sense that there's something bad called systemic racism, but most of the time people don't know what they're talking about when they use these terms. And by the way, I'm not saying there isn't something called systemic racism. I'm just saying that that the only the only explanation for systemic racism that I'm aware of as an academic is critical race theory, and this is what it means. Now, and this will be the last slide, this has very, very big implications. So if you believe this, if you adopt this as your explanation for the world, as opposed to, say, an Aristotelian approach, it has some really big implications. So, for example, under this theory, all members of the dominant group are per se racist. So if you're in the dominant group, you're part of the problem, per se. We don't go to the individual level. The group is the problem. And so everyone in the group is tagged as being racist. So you're either, if you're in the dominant group, you're either a racist who accepts that you're a racist, or you're a racist in denial of being a racist, but either way, you're still a racist. Your individual character is irrelevant. And this is a very grim prognosis, right? So this is a very depressing theory because there's no way out for anybody, right? This is sort of the really the bad thing about this, is that the people in the dominant group are really being told that you really can't absolve yourself from being a racist, even through your personal acts or whatever it is you do. Even if you admit you're a racist, at the end of the day, you're still part of the problem no matter what you do. But from the same point of view, minoritized individuals are also told that, well, you're stuck in this hierarchy of social power and you're being oppressed, and sorry, but there's just nothing you can do to escape the oppression. And so to me, it's a very, very dark theory. The focus on materialism is not helpful because we know already from Aristotle, if you believe Aristotle, that the pursuit of materialist things is actually not what brings you happiness anyway. So even if you fought to become the dominant group and then bathed yourself in material well-being, you would still not be happy if Aristotle is correct. And I think he is correct. So, and then finally, and this is also, so there's sort of all these dark implications. The other is that you notice the idea is that structural racism is in everything. And you do see some crazy things these days, like people saying, well, 2 + 2 doesn't have to equal 4 because, that's just racist. It's like every idea, every institution, everything around you is racist. Well, if that's true, how do you end the racism? Well, you just have to destroy the system and start over again. I mean, the critical race theorists who take their theory seriously will tell you quite honestly, yeah, that's true. We just have to destroy the system, just tear it down and build a new system. But of course, if you believe their theory, that's just going to invoke a new cycle of a dominant group and people being oppressed and so on. So this is really out there. It's really a strong point of view, and it's really antithetical to the approach of Aristotle and the individualistic view that we're all struggling to become virtuous and to love one another because all human beings have human dignity, and it's part of our human nature, and we love people because they are human, versus this, which in some form or another we're just seeing an awful lot of. So this is another thing that I really highlight to my students so that they, are aware of this. And I would just end by, something else that I tell my students, and it's something that a philosopher told me. And that philosopher said, look, everybody has a philosophy. The only question is whether you've examined yours or not. So I think it's very, very important. And I know that you ladies at Kintor do an awful lot of self-examination, and you think about these things a lot. But one of the reasons that I'm hoping this talk is helpful to you is that in the people that you meet outside of Kintor and outside of your community, if you're adopting that servant's heart, that loving attitude, then you do want to be helping others and doing good for others. And I think kind of understanding these concepts and distinctions between Aristotle and, for example, critical race theory may actually help you do that. Okay, thank you for the extra time. That was a little bit like taking a drink from a fire hydrant, but I hope it was interesting. Should I answer questions, or should we just call it quits?
I think we can answer some questions, and if people need to leave, they can leave. There is a question right now that Nicole wrote in the chat. She's asking, what about the chimpanzees that learn how to talk, such as Nim? Why would she not be considered a rational soul?
Yeah, well, and the reason is because these uses of language are really consistent with imagination and not with abstraction. So just to give you sort of a stark example, if you think about a young human child, the human child will just be asking constantly questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do people die? Just this constant stream of questions, chimpanzees don't ask questions like that. No animal has ever asked a question of like, what kind of thing am I? Or what happens when I die? Or any indication of this sort of capacity for abstract thought. So they'll use language for things like tickle me now, I want food, and things like that. So they, which isn't to say that it's really remarkable that they can do this, but I think that thus far, all of the sort of actual instances of animal intellect can be explained by imagination. Now maybe they have an abstractive capability, but they're not using language in that way. And they're not asking questions that human beings would ask, when they're trying to get at conceptual ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you know what? I would be happy to, if you wanted to send me, I don't know if you have a list of the attendees, but I'd be happy to send you some reading recommendations, send you some links to some stuff. Would that be helpful? If you want to shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to send some links. Obviously, I would recommend Aristotle's Ethics as a starting point, but I'd be happy to recommend some other things too. You might even actually, what might even be helpful is, rather than me just sort of coming up with some things, if you wanted to email the organizer and just say, hey, this was the aspect of this talk that I found interesting, where would I go to get some more? And just give me those lists, and I'd be very happy to send you the reading that goes with them.
Perfect, we can do that. Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience, in this virtual audience?
Hello, Professor. It's Nicole again. I have one more question about the virtue love.
Yes.
What is the best way in obtaining it? So how do you kind of learn that virtue? Because it's not a vice, it's a virtue. So then how do you kind of attain that? How do you go about doing that? I know prayer is very strong, and knowing God and having a good relationship with God, but other ways as well to kind of think about that concept and to...
Yeah, so I'll say, look, if you're coming at this from a faith-based orientation, you're way ahead of the game, okay? So you're just way ahead of the game. So prayer, obviously very important, but here's what I think is really key. And it's funny, I just had this long email exchange with one of my MBA students who was, very focused on, I really want to do good for people. And, I'm thinking about, in addition to my MBA, getting a medical degree, or, being able to get into a position where I can really, be a big boss of a big company and really do a lot of good. And we had to go around and around on this a bit because he wasn't buying it initially. But I was saying, look, it's your day-to-day stuff. Okay, this is absolutely critical. So you waking up in the morning, spending a few minutes collecting yourself. If you've got a prayer life, fantastic. Giving some thought to the day ahead. What will be the challenges? What virtues are likely to be challenged? I'm likely to have a meeting with this person that always makes me angry, always pisses me off. And, and I know I'm going to be in that meeting, and I need to think about that now and just give a little thought about that in the beginning of the day. And then go through the day trying to be attentive to what's happening in the day. So this is one where, I think St. Jose Maria was 100% right on, where, the spirituality of Opus Dei is saying, look, It's all about being attentive in what you're doing and thinking about yourself as a child of God and thinking about what you're doing as being offered up to God. That's a great way to develop virtue, right? If you've got that perspective, you're going, well, wow, everything I'm doing is sort of an offering to God. That's amazing. But that means the little things, right? All of the little things. And those little things are all the little things that help develop that virtue. So if you want to develop the virtue of love, you need to have in place courage, temperance, humility, justice. All of those things are required, because otherwise you can't do good for others, right? Like, what does the other person need? Well, if you can't make that answer for yourself, how can you do it for someone else, right? So you've got to work on your virtue, on the little things, and then you've got to put yourself in a position where you are, really trying to think about, I've got a boss who, drives me crazy or isn't very helpful or doesn't like me very much or whatever. And you've got to shift and say, well, that's all her problem, right? Or that's all his problem. And so what I need to do for my own well-being is do the best job I can and make my boss's life easier, for example. And I'm going to do that, right? That's what I'm going to do. And I don't, and so doing this on a daily basis, the answer to your question, obviously it's a big question, but, and by the way, having a spiritual counselor, obviously is very helpful too. But my answer to the question is, you do it by taking care of the little things. If you take care of the little things, the big things will take care of themselves.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. I really appreciate it. I really loved your talk. I love Aristotle, so I'm really glad you got to talk about his theories. And also, I'm an engineer, so a lot of learning about sustainability practices. I really liked how you tied in sustainability and philosophical business aspects all in one talk. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with me. It was my pleasure, really.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor. I think we all enjoyed it. It was very insightful.
Great.
And thank you everyone for coming. I think we're going to wrap it up now. It's getting late. And I think Professor wants to go have his pizza with his wife.
I do.
Okay, thank you everyone. Have a great night.